Hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining the launch webinar of the UN Environment Programme and Consumers International's new report, Can I Recycle This? A global mapping and assessment of standards, labels and claims on plastic packaging. We are very excited to be sharing this with you. The agenda for today is starting with a summary of the report and explaining our main findings, followed by some comments from some guest speakers, and then there will be some time and space for you as the audience to raise any questions. I want to thank you now for the guest speakers joining. On this webinar platform, you're all on mute at the moment, and so please use the chat box function to raise any questions that you might have. And I will introduce you to the voices that you will hear today, and I'm extending my thanks now to the speakers on today's webinar, and we're looking forward to hearing your interventions and comments. I am Naomi Scott-Mearns and I'm moderating today's launch webinar. I work for Consumers International as the Sustainable Consumption Manager, and I co-lead the Consumer Information Programme of the UN One Planet Network, who released this report. Next, Nils Hoyer and Johanna Dopinghaus from the UN Environment Programme will be providing an overview of the report. And we're also proud to be joined by a range of speakers who will be sharing their insights on the report, and I will introduce you to each of them later on. The context of this report is that it's a joint report written by the UN Environment Programme and Consumers International, and it's an output of the Consumer Information Programme of the One Planet Network. The UN's One Planet Network is an officially recognised implementation mechanism of Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is sustainable consumption and production. Over the past year, the One Planet Network has been working on the topic of reducing plastic pollution, following a request by all of the UN member states at the UN Environment Assembly in 2019 for the One Planet Network to form a set of guidelines for businesses, governments, and consumers on the topic of how sustainable consumption and production is important for tackling the plastic pollution crisis that the world faces at the moment. And that pollution crisis is really especially prevalent in the marine environment. Indeed, the widely quoted statistics that by 2015 there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish is an issue that sustainable consumption and production can really tackle. The report is entitled, Can I Recycle This? A global mapping and assessment of standards, labels and claims on plastic packaging. And it tackles an area which has not been examined in detail before, which is the role of information to consumers, which is displayed on plastic packaging. The report conducts a global mapping of the main different types of labels and claims which are displayed on plastic packaging and associated with sustainability and disposability, and the standards and certifications that lie behind these labels. As part of the research, an expert assessment was also carried out, and some of those involved in that assessment are joining the webinar today, so thank you very much for your contributions. Assessing which labels and claims provide clear, accessible and reliable information to consumers was the focus of the consultation. And today's webinar provides a summary of the report, which will be officially launched next week on the 19th, and will be available for free download on the Consumers International and One Planet Network websites. So now I pass on to Nils Hoyer, Associate Programme Officer at the UN Environment Programme and a fellow coordinator of the Consumer Information Programme, who's going to provide an overview of the report and our key findings.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naomi, for the introduction. So hello and welcome everyone also from me. To start off the report presentation, let me just set the scene a little bit for you and why we thought we needed a report like this. So first of all, as Naomi already mentioned, plastic pollution is a big environmental challenge that we need to address. Only about 9% of plastics are recycled globally, 12% are incinerated, and the vast majority goes to landfill or ends up in the environment. And especially plastic packaging is among the most prevalent marine litter items and often only used one single time, even though it takes decades or even hundreds of years to decompose. Of course, also plastics can break down into smaller particles that then also can enter the food chain and end up in the human body. So there's a lot of concern as well from a health perspective, also because of the additives that are in a lot of plastic packaging. So it's important to find solutions and move towards a more circular economy of plastics. When we looked into the issue, of course, there's already a lot of initiatives underway, but where we thought from our program perspective we could add benefits is looking at the consumer information and how consumers are informed about the sustainability implications of plastic packaging. And we also, from the initial research, we saw that there's a lot of consumer confusion around plastic items and how they should properly be disposed. Consumers are increasingly aware of sustainability in general and plastic pollution in particular. They really want to reduce their plastic consumption and want this problem to be solved. So there's a lot of potential to engage them more on the topic. And when consumers look for information, they first look at the product's packaging, particularly for recycling information, but also other sustainability information. So this is a good opportunity to provide the information to the consumer and guide their behavior. And if you are engaging in more effective communication, that can empower the consumer to play a more important role in the transition towards sustainable consumption and the circular economy of plastics. So yeah, examples are also that around the confusion is, first of all, there's a lot of different labels and claims out there, particularly about, for example, bio-based, biodegradable, or compostable claims. These are not always clear to the consumer. So it's important that the communication is improved so that consumers have a better knowledge and information to make their decisions. For the report structure, so we used this three-step approach for the assessment that we did in the report. First of all, we identified standards, labels, and claims related to plastic packaging and foodware through an initial mapping, and then we categorized the labels and claims by functionality that we found. So the 5 most important categories were compostability, biodegradability, recyclability, recycled content, and bio-based plastics. Some of these terms, as I said, are relatively new and still not really clear to the consumer. Then in the end, we ended up with a comprehensive catalog of relevant standards, labels, and claims on plastic packaging. And this was then assessed. Particularly for the labels, we used the 5 fundamental principles of our another report from our program, the Guidelines for Providing Product Sustainability Information. This was published by UNEP and ITC in 2017, and the 5 fundamental principles are reliability, relevance, clarity, transparency, and accessibility. And so we looked into how these labels compare to these 5 principles, and this was done through an expert consultation that reviewed and assessed the labels and claims based on these principles. So we used in total 33 experts on consumer rights, packaging, labeling, and standards. And as Naomi mentioned, a few of these experts were from our program and are also joining us today in the webinar. Then the expert opinions or expert assessments were then aggregated into a net outcome score, and these were classified into positive, neutral, negative, or mixed. From the 30 labels that we assessed in the report, we had about 5 positive scores, 8 neutral scores, 6 negative scores, and 11 mixed scores. So it shows already that there is a lot of room for improvement in the consumer information. And now I'm handing over to my colleague Johanna for the second part of the presentation. Johanna, I think you might still be on mute.
Sorry. In the report, we looked at standards, labels, and claims. Standards are specific criteria or norms for goods and services. And there are 3 primary standard setting bodies that govern the relevant standards for sustainable packaging. There is the International Organization for Standardization, which does create the ISO standards. There's the ASTM International, and there is the European Committee for Standardization. If companies want to work with certifying bodies, if companies want to work with these standards, they have to work with certifying bodies to demonstrate compliance with the standard. This differentiates a standard from a label, for example. Next slide, please. Because labels are logos or stamps that highlight product characteristics, and they may or may not be represent a certification. In this report, 5 different categories of labels were analyzed. These categories differ in the message they convey to consumers. Some labels describe how the plastic was produced, for example, using recycled content or bio-based plastics. Some labels indicate product characteristics at end of life of the plastic packaging, like being compostable or being biodegradable. Other labels provide guidance to consumers on how to dispose of an item. And lastly, there are some labels that only indicate how the recycling of an item is financed. An example for this is the green dot, which is very well known. And the green dot label only indicates that a financial contribution was paid to a qualified national packaging organization for this item. Some key findings were made for each of these categories. Labels that indicate how a plastic was produced mainly fall short on consistency. The percentage of recycled content is often not well defined, and labels for bio-based plastics should differentiate between conventional biomass and sustainably sourced biomass. Moreover, correctly disposing of an item that is labeled as being compostable or being biodegradable is often not possible for the consumer because the infrastructure that is needed to do so is not available. This underlines the importance of local relevance in the context of labels, which is also very critical for labels for recycling guidance. Lastly, labels for recycling finance might even be misleading for consumers because they often use imagery that is suggestive of the general recycling symbol, which is not what they indicate. Next to labels, this report also analyzed claims on plastic packaging. Next slide, please. Claims are statements made by companies about qualities of their products. Similar to labels, some claims are suggestive of how a plastic was produced, like made from recycled plastic, made from ocean plastic, or bio-based. Additionally, companies often provide claims stating that their products would be recyclable or compostable and biodegradable. And the analysis of claims revealed similar shortcomings as the analysis of labels did. Next slide, please. The calculation of recycled content, for example, is often very unclear when companies state that their plastics are made from recycled content. And not all claims on bio-based plastics state as well that whether the bio-based sources are also sustainable or not. Claims on compostability and biodegradability often do not take into account the available infrastructure. And moreover, there are 2 important things that should be noticed at this point. First, the use of the general recycling symbol is not regulated, which means that a claim stating that something is recyclable without having a relevant label attached to it can often not be trusted. And second, claims like made from ocean plastic are used very widely, while recycling ocean plastic is only a lower priority solution as compared to tackling the root cause of plastic leaking into the ocean. From these findings, 5 recommendations were drawn, and I will pass back to Niels to present these recommendations. Niels?
And Niels, perhaps you are still on mute.
Sorry, yeah, I think my microphone muted itself, so sorry about that. Yeah, so the first recommendation that we would make is that businesses and also labeling organizations should follow the guidelines for providing product sustainability information in their plastic packaging communications. That means that they align them, their labels and claims with at least the 5 fundamental principles of the guidelines. There are also 5 aspirational principles outlined in the guidelines that go beyond this, but yeah, as the name suggests, they are more aspirational. then can be complied with. But if companies meet the 5 principles of reliability, relevance, clarity, transparency, and accessibility, that would help a lot to make labels and claims less confusing for the consumer and give them accurate and reliable information about the plastic packaging and its sustainability implications. Regarding this recommendation, we have one example, that is the SCS Global Recycled Content Certification label that we assessed in the report. Here there are actually there's a it's a verified process in place, and the certification scheme is compliant with an ISO standard. But if you look at the label itself, it doesn't convey a lot of clarity, because the imagery is quite confusing, and it suggests in a way to be a general eco label with the bird on the picture. It reminds more of forest or wildlife protection and doesn't immediately suggest to the consumer that this is about recycled plastic content in the product. The second recommendation that we made is that definitions need to be harmonized on a global level. So the current state of unpackaged communications is very confusing, and having more clarity and harmonized definitions could help reduce that confusion and increase the consistency of standards, labels, and claims. The inconsistency between definitions also makes it more difficult for the consumer to compare the sustainability characteristics of different products. 2 examples where we thought this was particularly problematic is claims about made from ocean plastic and claims about made from recycled plastic. For example, with ocean plastic, there's no accepted general definition what an ocean plastic is. So some companies really retrieve plastics from the ocean directly, but for others, it's more a definition of ocean-bound plastic. So it can be within, for example, 50 kilometers of an ocean or something like that. So obviously, those are very different definitions and implications. And ideally, this needs to be more harmonized, or at least clearly communicated to the consumer. Often this information is only available on a website or not directly on the packaging. With claims about made from recycled plastic, there's also a distinction between post-consumer content and pre-consumer content. So pre-consumer content is something that's been recycled in the industrial process, and that's very different from post-consumer content that is collected after the consumer has used the product. And ideally, the second one is the more important one, where we need to increase the recycling rates to avoid unnecessary waste. Also, we found that some consumers can confuse recycled content with recyclable claims. So one solution in the report is that sometimes claims are now used in combination. So a product can be using recycled content in the plastic packaging and also be recyclable. And then it's more clear to the consumer that those are 2 different things. The third recommendation that we wanted to make is that standards, labels, and claims need to better reflect actual conditions. So we found that quite often there can be a discrepancy between what claims say and what is likely to happen to that package in real life, particularly regarding compostability and biodegradability, but also recyclability. And this applies particularly also to developing countries where the infrastructure is often not in place to support claims about recyclability. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, they developed a definition for what recyclability should mean, and that's that recycling must be proven to work in practice and at scale in the specific location where the product is sold to make a claim about it being recyclable. And also, finally, claims and labels should be based on recognized national or international standards. Once again, compostable and biodegradable claims are particularly problematic here, because for now the infrastructure to particularly deal with compostable plastic is currently not really in place, and it's very unlikely that consumers will take the additional effort to compose plastic packaging unless it's home compostable, which is very often not the case. Most of the plastics are for industrial composting only, where certain conditions need to be met. And also for biodegradability, it's also often not really clear to the consumer how to dispose of these items at the moment, and it can actually give a false impression that it's acceptable to dispose of these packagings into the environment, so it can lead to increased littering or the contamination of recycling streams. The fourth recommendation that we made is that the use of the cherry arrow symbol should be restricted to indicating recyclability. This also refers to what Johanna already mentioned with the green dot label, for example, that has a similar icon but doesn't indicate recyclability, only that a financial contribution to a packaging recovery organization has been paid. But it's found on many products, and a lot of consumers think that this means the product is recyclable. And again, the confusion can lead to higher contamination of recycling streams, and also a false impression that actually more plastic is recyclable than is the case. And we suggest that businesses should redesign their image-based communications if they're using the arrows for something that is not indicating recyclability. So this should be the only application for the symbol. And the final recommendation that we made is that informative and verified recycling labels should be adopted and their proper use enforced. This is actually a category where we found some good examples, the two that are on the slide here. The Australasian recycling label used in Australia and New Zealand, and the Woolworths recycling labels in South Africa, both really provide clear information and also make distinctions between the different components of the plastic packaging and how it can be disposed. And this is the type of example that should be followed more often in other countries, and also for all plastic products ideally. So not all, usually this kind of labeling is not used on all products. This also means that governments need to support recycling efforts more and make sure that they provide the necessary infrastructure so that more plastic can actually be recycled and therefore also labeled accordingly. And now we can already come to the end of our presentation. We just want to give a bit of a future outlook of what is going to happen with this report next. So first of all, we will upload it to the One Planet Network website soon and also share it by email with all of the attendees of this webinar. Then later on, we also plan to work further on this topic by developing key messages and collecting best practice examples of how to communicate product sustainability information about plastic packaging to consumers. And we plan to develop the key messages for policymakers, businesses, and consumers, working again with different stakeholders in our program. So you're also welcome to join the Consumer Information Program if you would like to get involved in this work stream, or also just generally want to work more on providing consumer information for sustainable consumption and production. And all outputs of this Consumer Information Program's work on plastics will also contribute to the One Planet Network-wide Plastics Initiative that is currently running with all the 6 programs of the network. And the guidance document will be released in October or November 2020 that we will then present at the United Nations Environmental Assembly 5 in February 2021, if everything goes according to plan, given the current situation. And we, of course, also encourage you to share the key findings and messages of this report with your networks. So yeah, you're welcome to distribute this further and get involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and wonderful. So we've now heard about the implications, the scope of the report and the implications for businesses, governments, standard setters and consumers. And so now we have a range of speakers who are all going to reflect on that. So I now pass to Mr. Ulf Jaeckel, who's the head of division at BMU, the German Environment Ministry, who's going to provide some comments from the government perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Naomi, and thank you, Niels and Johanna, for the presentation of that report. That report is an important thing to us. Therefore, we also
Ulf, I think we lost you, or at least I can't hear.
Yes, it looks like we have lost Ulf for the minute. Perhaps while he tries to dial back in, if we could pass to Ava Schneider, if that's possible, please, who's going to provide the business perspective. So Ava is the Sustainability and Communications Manager at the European Brands Association, AIM.
Yes, thank you, Naomi. Good afternoon, everyone. As AIM, we are pleased to be part of the advisory committee of the Consumer Information Program of the One Planet Network. So first of all, thank you for the great work on the report, and congratulations to the team for presenting it today. The report is a great information source regarding existing consumer information on plastics packaging that gives a good overview on the current state of play and can be used by many stakeholders working on packaging with a focus on plastic and waste. So I was asked by Naomi and Niels to give a short outline regarding the brand perspective on this topic and AIM's and our members' current activities on packaging and consumer information. So thank you for inviting me. So when it comes to the empowerment of consumers to play their part in the circular economy, for AIM, simple, understandable and harmonized consumer information about the sustainability features of a product, proper waste disposal, anti-littering and recycling is key, and such information needs to be actionable by consumers. So these points are clearly reflected in the recommendations of the presented report, and the report will therefore, of course, also feed into our work on EU level. So first of all, Naomi, you skipped a little bit the slide. If you could go quickly back, please. So just for everybody who is not familiar with AIM yet, just to give you a quick overview. So AIM is the European Brands Association representing European manufacturers of branded consumer goods on key issues that affect the ability to design, distribute, market their brands. So overall, our membership comprises 50 European corporate members and 20 national associations. So altogether, we represent 2,500 companies ranging from SMEs to multinationals. So very broad membership of brands from food to non-food, including cosmetics, toys, but also luxury brands. Okay, maybe the next slide, please, Naomi. So this is just the overview on our members. Oh, I think Ulf is back. Next slide, please, Naomi. Okay, so I would like to start by emphasizing that the topic of consumer information on sustainability features of a product or packaging, which is also tackled partly in the report, and more general, the topic of consumer empowerment is one of the priority topics in the current green debate on EU level. It started with the new Commission publishing the European Green Deal in December last year. And as you can see here, the Green Deal tackles different priorities and sectors. Overall, it clearly calls for empowering consumers to make informed choices and play an active role in the ecological transition. So in the context of mobilizing industry for a clean and circular economy, the Commission published its new Circular Economy Action Plan this year on the 11th of March. The action plan highlights consumer empowerment as clear priority and refers to various initiatives in this area. So I will not go into detail into all these initiatives, but among others, it refers to setting minimum requirements for sustainability labels and logos and information tools, but also looks into the establishment of an EU harmonized model for separate collection of waste. So as you know, within the European Union and Europe, we have different waste and collection management systems in place, and even in some countries, different systems in the different areas. So in this context, policymakers will also look into an EU-wide labeling approach that facilitates the correct separation of packaging waste at source. Examples that are highlighted referring to consumer involvement are, for example, introducing labels, harmonized symbols, or information campaigns. So again, here also this clearly reflects the report and the work that has been undertaken by the Consumer Information Program. Next slide, please. Yes, and finally, I would like to give you a little bit an overview on initiatives that are currently undergoing with AIM and also brands involvement when it comes to consumer information, packaging and plastics. So the first point referring to the empowerment of consumers in Europe's digital age. So we believe in better consumer information through digital means, for example, by using QR codes, digital watermarks, etc. There is a huge potential for developing digital as an alternative or supplement to physical product information. And together with 21 other associations, we have called on the European Commission, advocating for a coordinated approach through, for example, establishing a dedicated European stakeholders forum for digital consumer information. The second point I wanted to mention here is Holy Grail 2.0, an initiative that looks into digital watermarks, not only used for consumer information, but for packaging that is coded with these digital watermarks in order to achieve more accurate sorting and higher quality recycling. AIM is currently involved in discussions on how to set up such an initiative. The third point I wanted to mention here, also referring to consumer information, is the nudge approach. As AIM, we promote this approach to inspire more responsible consumer behavior. And we have set up our Brands Nudging for Good initiative back in 2015 in order to demonstrate, but also to mobilize and encourage our brands on the basis of consumer insights to inspire consumers towards a healthier and more sustainable behavior. And the last point I wanted to mention here is the Circular Plastics Alliance. That is an initiative initiated by the European Commission in order to boost the EU market for recycled plastics. So this alliance is comprised of key industry stakeholders from the complete plastics value chain to work together to achieve the target of 10 million tons of recycled plastics in new products on the EU market by 2025. So this is the target that is set by the European Plastics Strategy. And AIM and also some of our members are involved in particular in the packaging working group within this alliance. So there's a lot of going on when it comes to consumer information, packaging and plastics at the moment, of course. Next slide, please. So on this point, I will finish my short presentation. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to raise them or just directly contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'm now hopefully going to be able to pass back to Ulf, who has managed to restore his audio.
Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can.
Naomi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Naomi? Naomi, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Then I'll start a bit again, starting with the UNEA 4 resolution, where providing guidance on handling of plastics for consumers, business, and government. That was the basis, so to say, for this work, and our government very much supported not only this work but also this resolution. Why? Plastic, of course, is everywhere. It's a part of the problem because it's very durable, and if it ends up in the environment and stays there, and may have some negative health impacts. But on the other hand, it's very it has a very positive attributes. It's a lightweight, durable, waterproof, etc. And when it comes to life cycle assessment, it has a better performance than many of the alternatives like one-way glass, metals, and so on. So it's very necessary to handle the plastic with care. A key thing to that is, of course, the waste management. If there is no proper waste management, if consumers don't know in which bin, so to say, they have to put the plastic, then they are more or less lost, and they just dump it in the environment. And in a lot of countries and in a lot of regions, the awareness is not there, and even in more developed countries like the country I am coming from, not everyone is aware that putting plastics not in the right bin and throwing it into the environment cause more harm than you think. So it's a task of the government to provide that waste management system, and it's also task to educate the consumer. But companies, producers, retailers should have their responsibility there as well. For example, in our country, the producer responsibility for packaging is of that kind that the companies have to put in place or set up a collection and recycling systems for all the packaging materials, and in some areas also beyond. So it's their responsibility, and they have also to educate the consumer how they can identify the plastic items and in which bin they have to put it. It's not easy, and you have to do it, repeat it from time to time so that consumers really can understand. So that it is easy for consumer to do the right thing with the plastic. So governments and companies have to, so to say, work together to direct the consumer to do the right thing. And of course, looking at reusable alternatives is something which helps to solve the littering problem as well. The report gives a very good insight of what is the status quo, and from that report there will be an extraction of guidance and key messages, which will also go to the as Niels already said, to the United Nations Environment Ministers Assembly next year in Nairobi, UNEA 5, and at least our government and most of the European governments are aiming at having an action-oriented outcome at this UNEA 5 to even better address the handling of plastics, and therefore this report is a very, very good base. That was it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for the technical problem. Again.
No worries, it happens to everybody at times. So next, I'm going to welcome Vamsi Shankar Kapilavai, who's a senior researcher at a consumer advocacy group in India, the Citizen, Consumer and Civic Action Group. Over to you, please.
Hi, thank you, Naomi. Firstly, I would like to thank you for presenting a very useful report, and congratulations to the entire team. And for the people who are not familiar with the Citizen, Consumer and Civic Action Group, we are based in Chennai, India, and we work on policy advocacy related to solid waste management, water and transportation, where our main aim is to provide data to the local bodies to help them make well-informed decisions. And related to plastic pollution, we work on brand audits, microplastic pollution assessment, and advocating practice related to plastic consumption reduction wherever possible, and ban on single-use plastics. So in India, we have a very serious problem related to solid waste management, and most municipalities or the local bodies are still fighting to achieve the principle of source segregation. And I think in lieu of this, I feel we are still a little far away from understanding the effect of labeling, which is present in this report, on plastic packaging, on consumer behavior in India. But nevertheless, I feel the report like this on sustainability information, verify the recycling labels, and reusability of plastic packaging will definitely help the future policy work in India. Before I go into the details, let me put in the context of the numbers in India, where we produce around 26,000 tons per day of plastic waste every day. And out of this, 1/3 is from the packaging, and 70% of it is mostly out of this plastic packaging is gone as a waste in short span, making it more or less like a single-use plastic. So what we advocate is we are requests of manufacturers to have proper R&D to make sure that to find alternatives for this problem packaging material, and also make sure that not only the recycling labels but the chemicals used in these certain plastic products or plastic packaging should be made available to the consumer. As coming from a scientific background, I believe this really adheres to make any kind of progressive steps to find alternatives for this plastic packaging, unless I know what exactly are the chemicals added to these plastics and what gives these extra properties or unique properties to these plastics, so that can make our research easy by having information about the chemicals present in this particular packaging materials. And other important issue which we would like to see is microplastics pollution, which we think we are slowly coming into terms with. And recently, World Health Organization has also called for further assessment of microplastic pollution in the environment. So I think on the whole, the reduction of plastic usage should be at the forefront. As Mr. Jaeckel has mentioned, plastic is a unique material, but I think we should also look at the alternatives to it. It is very unique material and it has its own properties, but the management of it is a bigger issue. And to address this, we also feel like another key step we should take is extended producer responsibility. And as a part of it, where the producers are entitled to take their waste back, I think that is not happening at the moment, and more emphasis should be happened on implementing this at a more stricter level. And why I'm saying this because whatever the decisions related to certain type of plastic selected to make certain product, and what are the materials selected for its package, and all the decisions related to this are taken at the manufacturer level, and the consumer doesn't have a say at any of this stage. And I believe for this, the emphasis should be on the manufacturers to take responsibility of this plastic. And as the report mentions, the recyclability depends on the infrastructure. So I think the notion that recycling can be seen as a solution is false, and only comprehensive plastic recycling can be seen as a solution to limit the problem to a certain extent, but not as a whole. The consumption reduction or the plastic production reduction should be at the forefront of all these plastic pollution problems. So I think on this front, this report is highly helpful for the future policy work on reducing the plastic pollution. And I would again like to congratulate the team for preparing such a wonderful report. Thank you so much.
And now finally,
Naomi, I can't hear you anymore. Sorry. I think while Naomi is trying to resolve her audio issues, maybe I'll just...
If it's fine with you, Niels, this is Björn Eklund speaking. So I guess that she was trying to introduce me.
Yeah, exactly.
Shortly. And if you reach me now, I could have a short comment on the report. I'm very happy to. I'm also on the multi-stakeholder advisory committee for the Consumer Information Program, representing the global eco-labeling network, the network for almost 30 eco-labeling schemes, eco-labeling in the sense of the most stringent requirements with life cycle based approach and multiple criteria with a third-party verification. We do have some of our members that have requirements and do actually eco-label packages, but normally we don't do it. We have the approach that from a life cycle perspective, that our plastic package is relevant for the product group where we are making the requirements, and what kind of plastic packages are in that case best from an environmental point of view, and also naturally from a recycling point of view, to avoid laminates and to have clear and obviously easily adoptable messages on the package. This is one way of doing it when we are looking more on general or more broad product spectrum for the eco-labeling. But I'm also involved and want to refer you to the work that we are doing in the International Standard Organization, ISO, for the moment. We are revising the general requirements for environmental information and coupling that standard 14020 with the main issues from the standard 14021, which is about the claims, self-declared claims, and most of these labels and claims on plastic packaging are self-declared, even if there is a program in the basis for many of them, not all. This work in ISO is for the moment, we're working almost every night nowadays. We have an Australian and Canadian and Europeans on the call. So we have been working this week and next week on making a first draft for consideration, and that will include also definitions, these definitions on recyclable and biodegradable and so on, with reference to accepted international concepts. The thing is that I think it's very important, as it was stressed, that we have international and global adopted definitions of what is possible to do when we have a plastic package that should be recycled as long as possible or reused. It is important to have the information adopted on an international basis, and the information that is needed for an environmental package, or for the environmental information needed for a plastic package for recycling it correctly is, as Niels showed, these two most praised two of the labels about recycling. There's a lot of detailed information for all parts of the package. It's about how the different parts are separated and recycled in their own ways, and also looking in back to from what kind of raw material has been used in producing this package. So as a whole, I think this is a very good example. The report is a very good example of how the guidelines that we developed in the program for consumer information in 2017 can be applied to the consumer information that is needed, and in the end, the same information has a value independent of where in the world you are. Then, naturally, as it has been stressed, there has to be the infrastructure for recycling. And if there is no infrastructure for recycling, then the issue of using plastic packages is on stakes. If you can't recycle it, then or there's no system to collect it, then there should be other materials in use, I guess. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Bjorn Erik, and thanks a lot to all of the speakers today. Thanks everybody for your questions that have been coming in thick and fast. We've had a lot of requests about this presentation and the report, and just to let you all know that this presentation will be distributed, as well as the report, to all the attendees on the webinar and yesterday's webinar too, so make sure you check your inboxes for that. So now some questions. So firstly, Mr. Reinhard Weisinger has asked, you mentioned ISO, ASTM and CEN as the standard developers that formulate the requirements for plastic packaging. but it's not clear to me which standards the analysed claims in the report use and how they do it. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to take this question. I think so. First of all, the standards, we provided an overview of the existing standards in the report that relate to plastic packaging, either, for example, compostability, recyclability, or biodegradability mainly, I think. In terms of the assessment, as I said, the labels and claims were assessed against the 5 fundamental principles of the guidelines for providing product sustainability information. And the first principle on reliability kind of references mostly to being aligned with standards as increasing the reliability of the label or claim. So this is how the standards kind of fill into the assessment. But of course, there are also other 4 other principles. So just being aligned with standards alone is not necessarily guaranteeing a good score in the assessment. It's also important to mention the limitations of the standards that we pointed out in the report. For example, if you look at composting or compostable plastics in particular, there are some standards on that topic, and the turnover time they have for plastic to be considered compostable is sometimes longer than the actual practice in a composting facility. So that means the facility would either refuse the compostable plastic, even though it's in line with the standard, or it will just filter out the plastic packaging because it's not composted by the time the composting process has finished. And that shows the limitations of existing standards and why they need to be more aligned with the real practice.
Great. And a question from David Niffenegger. Often the recycling systems differ highly from country to country, and they're not harmonised at all, and especially with regards to treating plastic packaging. But on the other hand, the same plastic packaging items are shipped in identical layouts to many, many countries. So what would you recommend? How should brands label their packages in such cases? And is there any best practice examples that they could follow?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. Of course, I mean, it's a costly process for businesses if they have to customize the packaging for every different country. But I think ultimately this might need to happen because, if for example, there is a claim about recyclability, but that only applies for certain countries, then this needs to be made clear on the packaging. I think in Europe, I can see that happening already. For example, I'm currently living in France, and there's some packaging here that is also sold in Belgium or in Spain, for example, and then on the packaging, they actually have different recycling instructions, even between those developed countries, on how the packaging can be recycled. Sometimes, for example, the lid is only recyclable in one region, but not in the other. And I think, yeah, ultimately this needs to be made clear to the consumer. Otherwise, how can the consumer dispose of the item correctly? Yeah, I think alternatively, definitely there can't be a claim made about something that is not true in all locations where the product is sold.
If I may, on the topic,
sure,
to have a comment on this. Yeah. So so brands are faced with this problem, of course. So it already is happening that you have different, let's say, labels, sometimes now even becoming mandatory in one country compared to another, where this is a completely different waste system that we are faced with. And then, of course, you have to, I mean, it's clear that you can't have 10 different labels on one packaging. Like it has to be feasible in terms of positioning and also proportionate to the packaging size, whatever communication we want to give to the consumer. So one point where we think that, so on EU level, as I said in my short presentation, actually, it is now looked into how to harmonize waste management systems. It is a huge task. It is, of course, very difficult. And I think to kind of balance a little bit this approach, we really believe that information through digital means on a packaging could help here to give really a little bit this, the more details that just you cannot put on a packaging, to make it easy for the consumer, but of course also feasible for the industry and the brands.
Thank you. And so a question to each of the panelists from Samantha Webb from the UN Environment Programme. So she said it was great to see the good example of labelling from Woolworths supermarket being displayed. And in Australia, she's saying in many countries, there's a small number of large retailers control a huge market share of purchases, and therefore they have a strong potential to influence the consumption of plastic packaging. So are any of the panelists able to offer any insight on what do you think the opportunities are in countries with working with large retailers on standards and labels for plastic packaging of the products?
Maybe I can also give just a thought on this. So I think it's definitely the right approach to that industry, brands and retailers. These are the companies that put their packaging out there and that have to, of course, also make sure that consumers get the right information on sustainability features of the packaging and the product. So yeah, definitely, like working together with policymakers, which is also happening here on European level, is absolutely the right approach.
Great. And another question, perhaps to Nils here. Is it possible to tackle the problem of recyclability through just an international standard to help consumers? Do you think that is the solution?
I think so. Seeing the limitations of standards, I think that alone will probably not be the solution. I think if standards are more aligned with actual practices and more harmonized as well in terms of the definitions on a global level, I think then that can certainly help. But yeah, maybe I don't know if Jon Erik has more insight as he's often working with standard bodies.
Well, my comment would be that the definitions of what is recyclable and what is compostable and so on, that is something that we can make very large global agreements upon, of what is the content and what is the actual aim. But then for the systems of collecting for this kind of activity, I mean for composting, for instance, that's something that you have to construct then on the infrastructures and issue for the authorities to establish. And what we saw in this study was also that actually there are labels established or claims established as a with authorities as program operators, so to say, that they define that you have to use this kind of labels, and the systems to actually for the consumers to have the ability to follow that is not there in place. So it's very important that the message on the package is reflected in the abilities for the consumer to do that. And the responsibility in the end is not with the consumer. It is like Eva said, that for the brand owners, for the producers, for the retailers, they have the main responsibility that the information given is correct, but the systems and the creations or the definitions, that is something that the international standard we can do standardized for the whole world.
Thank you. And one last question from Hui Ho has come in saying that we analysed the claims using the guidelines for providing product sustainability information, but they were interested to also know whether a consumer survey on consumers' perception of labels had been carried out.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, this was beyond the scope of this paper. I mean, we did in the introductory part of the present report, we do cover a couple of consumer insights from other studies, but to my awareness, an assessment of the perception of different labels and claims from consumers around the globe. I think that hasn't been done yet, but it would certainly be very interesting how these labels are perceived by consumers and which ones they consider more clear. Just to say, of course, the expert panel that we used, we had a very good geographical representation and also different backgrounds from the experts we consulted.
Great, and maybe that's something we can do next. So thank you everybody very much for your attention today and for joining. As I said earlier, you can expect a copy of this presentation, the slide deck, including the release of the new report coming into your inboxes very shortly. I wish you a good rest of your day, and the contact details for everybody involved are on the screen at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well for me. Have a good day.